Donegan, another of our Simic Ramp players, and we have 3 decks, standard decks here in the tournament. It was Simic Ramp, Jund Sacrifice that we saw last round, and then Simic Flash. Players have chosen one of those 3. Hobbs is our first player we're going to get to see pilot Simic Flash.
Right, and this is one where I think it's going to come down to play draw a lot of the time, just because Simic Flash being ahead on... Basically, just playing from ahead is so much stronger than playing from behind because you put the onus of action on your opponent, right? You make your opponent kind of commit into more awkward spots, or you actually get spots to develop your Brineborn Cutthroat, your Nightpack Ambusher, and so forth.
Something that Hobbs wouldn't like to see. So Zach had built his Simic Ramp deck to try to win the mirror, and what that meant is that he had played larger top-end threats like Mass Manipulation and main deck Aether Gust. He cut all his Arboreal Grazers, but Dylan Donegan did not do that. He is still playing Grazers in the deck, and it's a bit lower, which should give him some points against Hobbs' deck.
Right, and one of the big draws to the Grazer is, even if it's kind of a weak card on its face, in a lot of ways it enables one of your stronger plays, which is that turn 3 Nissa who shakes the world. Not to mention, developing mana onto the battlefield is going to invalidate things like Quench sooner from Hobbs.
So Donegan is on the play here. He's the 6th seed going into day 2. He had mulligan to 6 here.
Breadside, Risen Reef, pretty good at fixing a mulligan.
First match of standard for both these players. So the Simic Flash deck, if you're on the creature package, it's playing here. Brazen Borrower, Frilled Mystic, Hydroid Krasis, Nightpack Ambusher, and Paradise Druid. You see that start off with Paradise Druid from John Hobbs.
Who's the ramp deck again?
Right, even your Flash deck does have some ramp spells.
Right, and a lot of the strength here is this puts your opponent in the squeeze of play around Frilled Mystic or play around Nightpack Ambusher starting on the 3rd turn. Play nothing, they get to develop a 4/4 that makes 3/3s. Play something, and you just get time walked.
And we see Cavalier of Thorns for Donegan. He checks, hey, is this going to get quenched? There are 3 quenches in the main deck for Hobbs, but the answer is no, it resolves, and that's a big win here. It's going to get Aether Gusted, actually. Yes, as a spell, so he doesn't actually get the trigger, so hold on. And then Nissa, who shakes the world on the way back from Hobbs.
Oh, and 2 breeding pools on the battlefield. This means with only 2 permanents untapped, Hobbs still has these 4-drop plays available to him.
Yeah, in the main, when Hobbs can do things like get out with Ramp and Nissa and then have all these Quenches and Aether Gusts and Mystical Disputes main, this is a really tough matchup for Dylan Donegan.
Right. We see Hobbs just ahead on the battlefield, exactly what we were talking about before. This is this exact spot that Hobbs wants to find himself in.
Scratch the bottom, Growth Spirals. Activates the land and attacks in for 10. Donegan to 7, draws a card.
It's always so demoralizing when they growth spiral with 5 lands and don't put anything into play.
Can't beat the onboard Nissa. And Hobbs with a quick Game 1 win over Dylan Donegan.
Right, and that's exactly the game that Flash wants to play. It had a 2-drop mana accelerant, it counters spell, and then it played a Nissa, countered another spell, and the game was over. It only actually needed 2 counter spells.
Right. I mean, it's not the kind of deck that can play actual control. You know, it's good for about 2 counter spells.
Exactly, and as long as it can counter the 2 payoff cards, which in this case was just the same Cavalier of Thorns twice, that's just fine.
So one of the things I respect then in this post board is the players are going to try to get closer to the ground. Interestingly enough, on Dylan Donegan's sideboard, he has a Theo 4/4/4/3 in his sideboard.
That is clean.
But almost all of it looks like it can come in here. 4 Aether Gusts, 4 Mystical Dispute, 4 Lovestruck Beast, 3 Shifting Ceratops. I like all of this. Is that crazy?
Yeah, so a lot of what I like doing in this particular matchup is leaning less on being a full-on ramp deck and trying to actually have plays that can kind of maneuver around the counter spells they're playing. Reduce the efficacy of cards like Quench. You're going to get hit by things like Aether Gust sometimes, but if you can actually just morph into a bit more of a beatdown plan, that's going to be just fine.
So do you want all 8 counterspells on Dylan's side?
I definitely like Mystical Dispute. I think I like Aether Gust. It's hard not to like that card, especially since it's so good against all of Hobbs' payoff cards.
It'll be interesting to see how Dylan does this. If he goes that direction, at that point, he's fundamentally changing what his deck does.
Right. And, I'm a little bit less positive on exactly Lovestruck Beast, but a lot of the times you don't need things like Indra's Forerunners in order to win the game. You can just win with your Shifting Ceratops instead.
Yeah, I don't think I want these Forerunners. I don't want this Agent of Treachery. These are things that they just look like they won't resolve.
Exactly. The big clunky stuff is not really where you want to be because those spells generally don't actually have text boxes.
All right, we'll see players trade some 2-mana ramp for Donegan. It's going to be Hydroid Krasis for 2, swings it in. And yeah, we're seeing just how much ramp does he have. And if it's not too much, we might see both players play a tempo game plan where they sit back on their blue instance.
Right. This early Krasis telegraphs either having another Krasis or just not much action.
Take that, blue cards, though. It's Shifting Ceratops, cast by Dylan. It's going to swing in. That is out of the sideboard. Cannot be countered. Gains haste. Crashes in. Hobbs down to 9. If you want to play against a tempo deck, Ceratops is a nice card to have.
Oof. It just applies so much pressure here. Hobbs is already down to 9.
And you see Dylan continuing to work that mana advantage as now... This, to me, is where I think Dylan, as a player, is going to gain a lot of advantage. So, Dylan, we know him as, the Elemental token, a Delver player. Post-board, this matchup starts to feel a lot like a Delver mirror or a Tempo mirror, and that's where I think Dylan shines.
Right. This is actually, there are a lot of subtle things going on here that are kind of hard to keep track of, but Donegan is going to be able to maneuver very comfortably in this spot.
Yeah, and with ease, he sends it into a game 3.
Mm-hmm. And, Hobbs is no slouch either. This is exactly what got him to the Players' Championship was combat math with humans and tempo strategies. Lots of Frilled Mystic decks.
So we will be going to a game 3. You mentioned Frilled Mystic there. That's a card. So when we have this Flash Mirror, it's one of the differences between the decks. We do see 4 Frilled Mystics in Hobbs' deck. No copies of that in Dylan Donegan's. Same time, Donegan gets the advantage on things like Shifting Ceratops.
Right, and a lot of the thing that you're going to see kind of be problematic for Frilled Mystic in the post-board games is we saw it just get Mystical Disputed that last game.
Yeah.
Aether Gust and Dispute are both big ways to gain a mana advantage on a 4-mana spell.
Yeah, and that's the thing that I'm not sold on with the card. It's a 4-mana counterspell, and it's only a 3/2. And this is a matchup that's about mana advantage and about stats at some point. I guess Frilled Mystic has the advantage that it does both, but the disadvantage that it does both poorly.
Right, and it is definitely the kind of card that's going to be much stronger in your pre-board games when they don't have access to all of these Mystical Disputes, and all of those cards just are going to be able to come out ahead versus a Frilled Mystic. You're going to end up in more positions where you're going to struggle to favorably exchange your Frilled Mystic for other cards unless you end up ahead. Going into this last game, Hobbs is really going to want to try and place an emphasis on all of these ramp creatures in his deck in order to try and get out ahead of what Donegan is doing. That last game, we saw Donegan not really do anything early before that Hydroid Krasis, and if he does that on the draw against Hobbs, then it's going to be easier for Hobbs to kind of force Donegan into awkward positions where Frilled Mystic can be better.
So we do have them going toward a third game here. Hobbs will be back on the play. So we saw from Dylan a fair amount of sideboard here. We know that the top end has left. I expect Agent of Treachery, Forerunners have left, Finale of Devastation, probably Quasi-Duplicate. All these things that kind of break open the ramp mirrors to be gone. Is some of the mana acceleration gone? Is that crazy?
I think it depends on what you're looking at. I think Arboreal Grazer is going to be less good because it's just kind of a chump blocker a lot of the time, and you're not trying to emphasize jamming a Nissa on turn 3 into whatever Hobbs has. But I think things like Leafkin Druid you can still make a reasonable case for because it is actually a mana source on its own.
Both these players on ending day 1 very differently. Dylan Donegan, rough start in Legacy, 3-0'd his Modern. John Hobbs advanced from Legacy, then 0-3'd in Modern.
Look, sometimes you just have different days in different pods.
Yeah. first match of Standard for both players. Leafkin Druid on the play from Hobbs, just to get out a mana advantage. Dylan going to look to keep pace, but cannot. He says go. And now we get into the game where both blue mages here are just going to start passing with untapped lands. We saw an attempt on an end-step creature there, but it was Aether Gusted from Dylan. But the fact that he gusted there means Nissa, who shakes the world, hits the table for Hobbs.
And this is exactly the kind of play that we saw last week at the Mythic Championship, where you have this bait spell that will run away with the game if you don't counter it, into another spell that will run away with the game if you do not counter it.
It's hard to manage counter spells when you have to counter everything.
Right. Playing from behind like this is exactly the thing you do not want to be doing against this Flash deck.
And for Dylan, Leafkin Druid pass. Then he's going to, during draw step, Aether Gust the Nissa. And it was a calculated move here, but John says no, it's Mystical Dispute. Now he gets to attack, play Castle Vantress. That felt like Dylan's window.
That was the turn.
Yeah. It was a big risk, right? If he wanted Gust to resolve, he could have done it main phase, but then Hobbs would draw it again. And he said, I need more. I need you to not draw it this turn. So I'm going to let you draw a card. I'm going to hope to Gust it there. If I do, you won't have Nissa. It does mean that Dylan's going to lose to counter spells, but he decided that was a risk worth taking. Right. So he does that, and unfortunately, he runs right into a counter spell.
Exactly. It's a spot where you know he will draw the Nissa next turn, so all you can do is play with the information you definitely have.
5 mana from Donegan. Risen Reef of his own. Shifting Ceratops says go. Hobbs, Frilled Mystic, says counters it, counts it up, says yes, that's lethal, and it is. Hobbs takes the win. Hobbs moves on.
And the big thing that I want to look at